first batch of records we received in response to our lawsuit were about 1,500 records in total. And you know how many they gave us? In whole or in part? Less than 1% of that. Judicial Watch has been the leader in highlighting the abuse of Trump over these documents, the document issue, the fake document issue that the Biden gang came up with as a pretext to raid the former president's home. An unprecedented, abusive, in my view, illicit raid. As I've just talked to you before, and this is something else that is driving the left crazy, they mention my name all the time on this, that Judicial Watch had sued for similar records that Bill Clinton supposedly had. He had kept tapes where there were tapes related to his presidency, where he was being recorded talking to foreign leaders, inherently classified stuff. We thought, well, the Presidential Records Act applies to that. And we sued. And the Justice Department, the same gang running the National Archives, said, no, we can't get them. Not only can't Judicial Watch get them, but we can't even get them. The Justice Department lawyer went and told the court in open court, I had the transcript, I read it. The president has these records after he leaves office. They're presumably personal. And so when this noise started happening earlier this year about these records, these so-called presidential records Trump was persuaded to return, I thought, what's going on here? These aren't presidential records, they're personal records. Why did the Justice Department change their position? Why were they ignoring law? Why were they ignoring precedent? The court told us no one can second guess the president's decision making here. So they set Trump up and persuaded him to return documents, convinced him or convinced his lawyers that to call them presidential records when in fact at best they were personal records he was voluntarily disclosing to them, and then use that as a justification to raid his home. Outrageous abuse of power. And they're still messing around and thinking of indicting him for supposedly having classified records, which were inherently unclassified by the virtue of the fact he was in possession of them. And why is that? Why am I making that analysis? Because I'm following what the Justice Department position had been as it relates to these types of records. So new rules for Trump again, right? And as soon as the raid happened, we rushed the court to try to unseal the warrant. We were successful there. And of course, we've been suing to try to get access to records about the raid and the dispute generally. And one of the first agencies we sued was the National Archives, which lied, in my view, to President Trump by saying he had presidential records that needed to be returned. Under this court decision and precedent and law that I'm telling you, and Justice Department's prior position, they had no right to demand the requests, to demand these records. They weren't presidential records. They were deemed personal in virtue of him having them. Or his having them, I think is the proper grammar. So we sued the archives for this fake dispute they made up with the president. And you know what they did? They started releasing records to us. And typically what happens is when the agencies start releasing records, they pretend, oh, we can only look at 500 pages a month. It's just too hard. Or, a select portion of the records, and, it's going to take us, several months, if not years, to get through them all. So sure enough, the first batch of records we received in response to our lawsuit were about 1,500 records in total. And you know how many they gave us? In whole or in part? Less than 1% of that. So they hid over 99% of the records about the raid. Now, this is the National Archives that their position is we got to have all these records from President Trump because the American people have a right to know what their government's been up to. But no, not when it comes to them. So we FOIA under the law. They ignored the law, hence our lawsuit. Just to be clear, the National Archives ignored the FOIA law that required them to turn over records or otherwise answer us. They didn't do it. And the only reason they're doing it now, and of course they posted it online pretending they were doing it out of the goodness of their heart as opposed to pursuant to a federal lawsuit. As I said, the only reason they did it was because we sued. So when they talk about transparency and how, no one can hide records, no one's above the law, they're hiding records right now. And you can bet the FBI isn't going to raid the National Archives. And you can bet the FBI isn't going to raid itself. Because we got lawsuits against the FBI and DOJ. They gave us only 65 pages out of the 1,600 pages they had turned over, more or less. We wanted all records regarding referral from NARA, the National Archives and Records Administration, to the Department of Justice regarding the records management procedures of former President Trump. The request includes all related records of communications between any official or employee of the archives or any official or employee of the Department of Justice or any other branch, department, agency, or office of the federal government. Like the White House. All records regarding the retrieval of records from President Trump or any individual or entity acting on his behalf by the National Archives and the Records Administration. This request includes related records of communications between any official or employee of NARA and President Trump or any individual or entity acting on his behalf. So not a lot of records, right, in theory. So what are they hiding? They're hiding virtually all of them. In response to the first batch, they found 309 pages, but only released 11 pages. So that was, there were 309 pages, at least initially, of records of communications with the Justice Department. Only 11 of them have been released to us. In the second batch, essentially the communications with President Trump and his team, they found 1,300 pages, but only released 54 of those pages to us. Now, what did they release to us? We put them online. We have a link in our press release. I don't know, they're on our site, or did we link to the archive site? I don't remember. They released a few pages of correspondence with Congress, much of which has been released before, and a new email with President Trump's representatives in which the archives asserted alleged authority over records in Trump's personal possession. So when we say alleged authority over records in Trump's personal possession, what I mean to say, if I were writing this and just personally, they lied to Trump about records in Trump's personal possession. They suggested to Trump they weren't his when in fact they were. And if I were Trump to this day, I would say to the courts, and his team hasn't said this as directly as they should have, I think, I would say all those records are mine and I want them all back. Because under the law, I get to choose what are presidential records and what are personal records. And under the prior Justice Department decision, I really don't have to do anything other than take them with me. And if they're with me here, they're personal records. That was the Justice Department's position for Bill Clinton, and they just can't lie to you and suggest I did something wrong here. I want the records back. Now, what is the archives? What is the Biden archives saying? Why can't we get these records? So let me explain FOIA to you. The Freedom of Information Act requires agencies of the government to turn documents over about certain government activities. And obviously there are national security exceptions. Sometimes they don't even have to acknowledge that there's a certain government activity. For instance, if, it's too secret to even to say, no, it doesn't exist, because that would tell the bad guys something. But typically, let's say, let's talk about the raid. They have to turn over records about the raid. Now, do they have to turn over all records? No. There's records that they can withhold in whole or in part, citing certain exemptions in law. And some of the exemptions are pretty easy to understand. Like, I'm not going to be able to ask for President Trump's Social Security number. That's privacy protected material. Other claims tend to be pretty broad in scope and in the eye of the beholder. For instance, deliberative process material, which is the sort of pre-decisional material, which is really very interesting to people, isn't it? I want the back and forth prior to a decision, and they usually try to withhold that. There's nothing requiring them to withhold it, like Social Security numbers, but they often withhold that because that's where all the juice is. Other records exemptions here are, again, B5, which is this internal deliberation process, which is completely discretionary. Completely discretionary, they're withholding these records. B6, which is personal privacy. Now that can be something about Social Security numbers, but it also could say, they could also be pretending to be concerned about President Trump's privacy, as if that's a legitimate concern at this point. B7A, records compiled for law enforcement purposes. B7C, which are similar law enforcement records that relates to someone's personal privacy. So if they get records, let's say they dig through your bank records, they can't turn those over. And B7E, again, is law enforcement. So there's a bunch of records being held under deliberative process. Law enforcement is tough to get around because, you know, there is a law enforcement investigation going on, however corrupted. So they're hiding a bunch of records, many of which that in their discretion, even under the law enforcement exemption, they can release. So that's where we stand on Joe Biden's raid on Trump's home. There are 1,000+ pages of records that are being hidden by the Biden administration about its unprecedented raid. In the meantime, they're leaking information about what they found, about what Trump did. I think the Washington Post had a story out of the Justice Department, again, leaked to try to smear him, that they were concerned because he was moving boxes around his house. So now, according to the Justice Department, moving boxes around your home is evidence of a crime. That's where we are with this crazed Justice Department. That while protecting Joe Biden and Hunter Biden, as I will describe and have previously described, they are harassing Trump in ways that I think, if it weren't so outrageous, would cause sensible people and sensible prosecutors to laugh out the outrageousness of it. And so Judicial Watch, as we said in our release, is not going to give up here. The Biden administration is in cover-up mode on its abusive and unprecedented raid of former President Trump's home. The archives pretends to be concerned about public access to public information, while unlawfully ignoring FOIA law and using a myriad of excuses to hide records about its manufactured dispute over the Trump records. So they're all liars when they say they're concerned about transparency. They're enemies of transparency. How do we know? Because we're suing them in court over it. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and like our video down below.